So, chapter 17 is called Freedom's Boundaries at Home and Abroad. Chapter 16 was about the Gilded Age, which had a lot to do with industrialization, the labor response to industrialization, the clashes between labor unions and monopolist tycoons. And chapter 17 really grapples with the American foreign policy of this time period and how it contrasted with race tensions back at home, with labor tensions back at home, and was the United States government really having its priorities in order. So we're contrasting here the Gilded Age with some of the American expansion that goes on throughout the late 1800s and into the turn of the 20th century. So we mentioned the difficulty that farmers were having in the Gilded Age. And when supply exploded and demand only gradually grew as it traditionally had, you had farmers that lost their farms, moved to the city, and were working for extremely low wages, were disgruntled, missed their former life on the farms. And so really what started as a farmers' movement but grew into a full-blown populist movement began with a man by the name of William Jennings Bryan, who ran for president in 1892. And some of what he ran on, the party platform, was a graduated income tax. Let's tax the incomes of rich people. The higher the income, the higher the tax rates. Again, graduated. It would get slightly higher the higher you went in income. Established savings banks in U.S. Post Office, and here's the key that was controversial, run by the government. So instead of private banks, you'd have banks that were run by the government. Government ownership and operation of telephone and telegraph companies. Again, government intervention in the economy. Remember, in the Gilded Age, you had a lot of people who promoted laissez-faire capitalist theory, and so government intervention to them sounded more like socialism. And so the populist movement was very, very controversial and seen as extremely radical. Also, to get more citizen participation in government, you had the promotion of direct election of senators. To support the labor movement, you had a movement for the 8-hour workday. And then you had state laws that would allow for things like initiatives, citizens forcing the government to talk about new laws and regulations, or referendums where citizens would vote directly on proposed laws along with voting for their candidates. So more democratic elements to our American Republican system. And this leader, William Jennings Bryan, you can see him pictured here on the left. Now, he was deemed a crazy radical in the 1890s when he was promoting these ideas. Well, it's funny because 20-some-odd years later, you have Woodrow Wilson on the right become president of the United States. And he actually achieved some of these goals that Bryan had set out to achieve in the 1890s. So in time, with more and more discussion, more and more promotion of the ideas of the populist movement, they became popular enough where even mainstream politicians like Woodrow Wilson accepted, promoted, and got them passed into law. So, as we discussed before about American expansionism, we've discussed it only briefly, but to get into some of the nitty-gritty details of that, how expansionism opened markets for the United States. First, you have Commodore Matthew Perry visiting Japan in 1853, and got Japan to sign a treaty with the U.S. guaranteeing friendly trade relations. It could have had something to do with the fact that he parked a bunch of naval destroyers off of the coast of Japan, and it was very intimidating during the negotiations. In 1899 and 1900, the U.S. was worried about the influence of Europeans in China and initiated the open door policy that would allow any nation to expect equal trading rights in China. And then U.S. sugar growers were actually directly involved in overthrowing the Hawaiian government in 1893 in an attempt to turn the territory over to the U.S. government, which would then in turn increase their profits. So for a 5-year window, Hawaii was independent, and then in 1898 it actually became a U.S. territory. So you have U.S. expansion going on in Japan, in China in 1899 and 1900, and in Hawaii becoming an official U.S. territory in 1898. So this expansionism is all about opening markets and making money. Some visuals. This is a visual here of Commodore Matthew Perry. That's who we're referring to historically. We are not referring to the actor who portrayed Chandler on the TV show Friends, which if you haven't watched, then you're uncultured and you should go watch it. And then there's a political cartoon here of the Hawaiian situation explained. And why would the Queen of Hawaii, which look at the absolutely racist imagery that they use to depict her, why would she not want to return to her throne? Because there was some discussion that, like, oh, Hawaii actually wanted to have a big change, and the monarchy didn't even want to return to the throne. Well, why is that? Well, because of the threats of the sugar goers and the possible assassination that could happen, which is portrayed with the throne that has many, many swords sticking out of it. So this period of American expansionism is historically often referred to as American imperialism. Those in favor of expansion were saying that the U.S. needed these new markets. The western frontier had already been developed. There's not much further growth that can be done at home, so we need economic growth globally. Those who opposed expansion said that expanding U.S. influence in the world first and foremost went against the traditional Washingtonian neutrality that had been promoted ever since Washington's farewell address. And they believed that entangling ourselves in foreign affairs would only lead to bad things. It would give foreign nations and empires a bitter taste of the United States, and it would lead to bad things in the future. Now, how is this expansionism possible? And I think we mentioned this in the Gilded Age lecture about naval power. And one of the reasons that we gobbled up territories was to expand naval power around the world with naval bases everywhere. So you can see this political cartoon that shows the gradual changes to Uncle Sam. He's just a little infant in the Revolutionary period. He's just a small frontiersman in the early Republic. He's a bona fide soldier shortly after the War of 1812. And then, boy, look at this distinguished gentleman here at the beginning of the Civil War. Well, then you see him rather gluttonous. He's smoking, he's fat, here around the time of the Spanish-American War. And after the Spanish-American War and other actions like receiving Hawaii after the Sugar Trust overthrow of the Hawaiian government, all the acquisitions from the Spanish-American War, which we're going to discuss here in a second, you see just how obscenely fat, and he has under his arm the key to all of this expansionism, which is a naval vessel. The Spanish-American War, well, what led to the Spanish-American War? People need to be convinced if they're going to fight and die and shed blood in a war. And how were they convinced of war with Spain? Well, you have long-term bad-mouthing of Spain. First of all, you had yellow journalism. You had people in the press who were sensationalizing stories that were anti-Spain to start establishing a anti-Spain attitude in the United States. And then you have the Delome letter, in which the Spanish minister to the U.S. criticized President McKinley. And a lot of people demanded war. McKinley held off from that, really pretty much saying, like, you know, I'm sure a lot of people badmouth me. I don't need to fight a war with people who badmouth me. But then the catalyst. So these are long-term things. Yellow journalism, Delome letter. These are build-up things. The catalyst is the sinking of the USS Maine in Havana, Cuba, a few days after the Delome letter was printed. So the bitter taste of things like the Delome letter are still in the taste buds of Americans, and there's all of a sudden immediate blame put on Spain, which was the nation in control of Cuba at the time, and war soon followed. That is when we officially entered the war with Spain. Now the thing is, to this day, no one is entirely sure what sank the Maine. It very well could have been the Spanish. However, there are theories that it was a boiler explosion, or self-sabotage even, to justify war. So there's no conclusive evidence one way or another what sank the Maine, but nonetheless, when you have bitter taste towards Spain, and you have, like, the yellow journalism going on, the journalists that are sensationalizing stories to begin with, the sinking of the Maine is what primarily was the catalyst moment to lead to war with Spain. Now, what are the motives, though? Like, why would the journalists already be setting the stage for war with Spain prior to even the USS Maine explosion? And what are the real reasons? Well, naval planners are viewing Cuba as a great location for a new naval base, and likewise, any other European nation controlling a base that was only 90 miles off the coast of Florida was unacceptable. And this is something that we come back to with the Cuban Missile Crisis in the 1960s. Also, you had U.S. sugar companies. Does this sound familiar? Sounds like Hawaii, right? Sugar companies had invested $50 million in Cuban sugar plantations, and the Spanish government was not being cooperative with these sugar companies. A friendlier, independent Cuba might be better for their profits. So the sugar industry had a lot to do with this as well. So Secretary of State John Hay, under William McKinley, actually referred to this as a splendid little war, because in the December 1898 treaty, Spain gives the United States the islands of Puerto Rico and Guam. It grants Cuba its independence, and it sells, again in quotes, this is a lot like the Mexican War, when we defeated Mexico, bought a bunch of territory for $15 million back then, while we buy the Philippine Islands for the bargain basement price of $20 million. Then, the Platt Amendment in 1901, after Cuba gained its independence, guaranteed that Cuba had to lease a naval base to the United States. Cuba could not allow any other nation to acquire Cuban territory but the United States. And Cuba had to allow the U.S. to intervene in their affairs whenever U.S. citizens were threatened. And this is the loosey-goosey, like, man, this could really turn into something if the United States wanted to turn it into something. After McKinley is assassinated and Teddy Roosevelt becomes president, Roosevelt believed that Spain and other nations were threats to U.S. security by having control of parts of Latin America. In his opinion, this was a violation of the Monroe Doctrine. So he used this reasoning to justify intervening in Latin American affairs. And this is known as the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. So this is really like a addition to. So it's almost like you're amending the Monroe Doctrine. The best example is when the U.S. sponsored an uprising in Panama in order to construct the Panama Canal for more efficient trade. So again, this sounds a whole lot like Hawaii, where you overthrow to get control of the sugar industry. Well, in this case, it was to get territory to build the Panama Canal. And what was the Panama Canal itself all about? It was all about transportation of naval vessels for national security and commercial vessels for expanding markets and making money. Then you have dollar diplomacy. Teddy Roosevelt was so popular, this is Teddy depicted here, that when he recommended one of his cabinet members to be the next candidate for president, William Howard Taft, he really promotes Taft. And so given his popularity, Taft becomes president. He continues a lot of Roosevelt's interventionist policies. He called his policies dollar diplomacy because he was often protecting U.S. business interests. So he thought he was protecting U.S. economic investment in Central and South America by intervening. So he's a little bit more open about the fact that it is money, in fact, that has a lot to do with U.S. foreign policy decision-making. Now, what's going on at home? Amidst all this, what's going on at home? The Jim Crow South is continuing to thrive in an environment where the United States is also claiming to spread democracy to other countries. What? Freedom, liberty being expanded to others? We aren't even providing authentic freedom and liberty to our very own citizens. So more and more legal measures are being used to limit black voting, okay? And we've already learned about this in our Reconstruction chapter, a couple chapters ago. And those were things like literacy tests, poll taxes, grandfather clauses. KKK membership and lynching is on the rise to terrify blacks. So anybody who actually could read and write, who could afford to pay a fee, who would be a qualified voter, just gets terrorized and prevented from going to the polls purely out of fear. And by the end of the 1890s, especially after the Plessy versus Ferguson decision, which we already discussed in the Reconstruction chapter, segregation is a universal practice in the South, mainly due to that Plessy versus Ferguson decision, because it was putting a rubber stamp of federal government approval on segregation, is what that court case was doing. So it's not that segregation didn't exist at all in the South prior. It certainly did, but it became universal practice once the federal government said, oh yeah, no problem, we won't interfere. And this leads to blacks in the South deciding it's time to get the heck out of Dodge. And so many blacks moved into the industrial Midwest, into the industrial Northeast, or to the West Coast to get away from this horrible Jim Crow South discrimination. This is the end of the Chapter 17 lecture. If you have any questions, by all means, please reach out to me. But otherwise, I will see you in class.